The 15th plenary meeting of the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly is called to order. Members will recall that in paragraph 8 of its resolution ES-11/4 of 12 October 2022, the Assembly decided to adjourn the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly temporarily and to authorize the President of the General Assembly to resume its meetings upon request from Member States. In this regard, I should like to draw the attention of delegations to document A/ES-11/10, which contains a letter dated 7 November 2022 from the permanent representatives of Canada, Guatemala, the Netherlands, and Ukraine to the United Nations, to the President of the General Assembly, requesting the resumption of the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly. I intend to conduct the proceedings of this meeting in accordance with the rules of procedure of the General Assembly and the past practices of its emergency special sessions. The General Assembly will now resume its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled Letter dated 28 February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, S/2014/136. In connection with this item, the Assembly has before it a draft resolution issued as document A/ES-11/L.6. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine to introduce draft resolution A/ES-11/6/L.6.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun, is written in one of ancient scripts. It is true, isn't it, that we have seen all these before. A country choosing to invade another, bringing death and destruction, impacting millions of people, undermining the very core of international security. The world fighting back and holding the perpetrators accountable. We have indeed seen this before. Let me quote one official. Large territory of our country was occupied by the enemy that destroyed entire cities and villages, turned into ruins enterprises, power plants, railways. That is why we believe it to be a moral right of countries that were subjected to occupation to receive compensation. End of quote. This quote does not belong to a Ukrainian official. Neither is it recent. This statement belongs to Comrade Vyacheslav Molotov, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union. It is striking how closely this statement describes that Ukraine is facing today. Large territory of a sovereign state under enemy occupation, entire cities and villages destroyed, enterprises turned into ruins, power plants destroyed. Of course, no material loss compares to the death and suffering of the people in Ukraine. 77 years ago, the Soviet Union demanded and received reparations, calling it a moral right of a country that has suffered war and occupation. Today, Russia, who claims to be the successor of the 20th century's tyranny, is doing everything it can to avoid paying the price for its own war and occupation, trying to escape accountability for the crimes it is committing. Russia will, however, fail, just like it is failing on the battlefield. We have indeed seen all this before. There is nothing new under the sun. 32 years ago, Russians once again clearly stated their position on reparations when one state invaded and occupied another. Responding to the consequences of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the UN Security Council adopted a series of resolutions, including Resolution 687, establishing a commission and a fund mandated to deal with any damage, loss, or injury arising out of Iraq's unlawful invasion and occupation of Kuwait. Following his vote in favor of the resolution, Soviet Ambassador Vorontsov stated, and I quote, "The requirements of the resolution adopted are aimed not only at restoring justice, but at issuing a serious warning to all those who might be inclined to embark on the path of aggression, occupation, and annexation," exactly what Russia does today. The Soviet ambassador also added, "The adoption of this resolution provides the necessary conditions to restore normal economic relations in the region. The speedy elimination of the consequences of the ecological crisis and compensation for the damage which has been caused to Kuwait and its people." Thus, with 14 votes and one measly abstention, the United Nations Compensation Commission was born. A true success story. UNCC completed its mandate in February this year, having paid out over $52 billion in reparations to the victims of that war. Russia has tried its best to destroy Ukraine in a very literal sense. From day one of the full-scale invasion, Russia has been throwing bombs, missiles, shells of every kind at Ukrainian cities and villages, targeting everything from plants and factories to residential buildings, schools, hospitals, and kindergartens. We've all seen images from Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanka, Mariupol, and Izum. Russia has been destroying Ukrainian roads, bridges, and railways. Russia has demolished almost half of Ukraine's power grid and utilities in the past months alone, leaving millions of Ukrainians without power, running water, and heating on the eve of winter. Accounts of atrocities committed by Russians in the occupied territories, murder, rape, torture, forced deportation, looting, they all speak for themselves. Millions of Ukrainians have been forced to leave their homes and seek shelter elsewhere. Ukraine will have the daunting task of rebuilding the country and recovering from this war. But that recovery will never be complete without a sense of justice for the victims of the Russian war. It is time to hold Russia accountable. We have seen all this in this very chamber. What has been done, we ask to be done again. We've seen the UN General Assembly pass by consensus a resolution adopting the basic principles and guidelines on the right to a remedy and reparation for victims of gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law. Let me quote, "Adequate, effective, and prompt reparation is intended to promote justice by redressing gross violations of international human rights law or serious violations of international humanitarian law Article 15. We have seen the UN General Assembly adopt by consensus a resolution commending draft articles on responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts that stipulates that the responsible state is under an obligation to make full reparation for the injury caused by the internationally wrongful act, Article 31. We have indeed seen it all. We're not asking for something we've not seen before. We are meeting here today in the setting of the 11th Emergency Session of the UN General Assembly within the Uniting for Peace framework designed for instances just like this, when a country like Russia abuses its veto power, a veto power that came with the seat it's illegally occupying of the Soviet Union in the Security Council. Russia prefers impunity to accountability, and when it comes to the process at the Security Council, it only knows two things: lies and veto. And yet we will hear from Russia very soon that the General Assembly is not competent to address a matter like this. It will be yet another lie, yet another attempt to diminish and subvert this body of the United Nations, yet another attempt to tell you that you do not matter, and that yet again will be nothing new. I have recently recalled the words of King Hussein of Jordan, pronounced from this very rostrum in 1960. Let me quote from him again. "It is needless to affirm that the United Nations presents the only hope of peace and freedom to humanity. This is of major significance to all the small nations of the world, yet almost from birth, the Soviet Union has sought to destroy the United Nations, to hamper its deliberations, to block its decisions, and by rowdy tactics and petulant walkouts to demean the reputation of the Security Council and the reputation of the General Assembly." End of quote. This is exactly what Russia is doing now. Having blocked the Security Council, the Soviet successors are trying to quiet the General Assembly. The UN should no longer tolerate this. Right now, there is yet another opportunity to send a clear signal to Russia and anyone else who ever considers using force to withdraw internationally recognized borders. Russians and their cohorts will try to make you believe that by this vote we are dividing the world into blocks and bringing it back to the times of the Cold War. They will claim that we ask the member states to take sides in the conflict. We in no way ask you to pick sides today. We are confident that you are all on the side of the UN Charter, its purposes and principles, and on the side of international law. Instead, it is the Russian Federation itself, which since its very appearance in the UN 31 years ago, has been perpetually committing acts of aggression against sovereign states. It is the Russian Federation which is threatening the mechanism of international security and undermining the fragile stability achieved after World War II. In fact, it is Russia that is to be blamed for dividing the world. The proposal in front of you today is a proclamation that Russia must be held accountable for its violations of international law in Ukraine. It is reaffirmation of the need of a concrete mechanism for reparations that will breathe life into this proclamation. It is a call for the member states to come together and build legitimate international infrastructure to deal with the consequences of Russian aggression against Ukraine, record evidence of atrocities, and preserve a hope for justice for millions of those whose lives have been changed forever by imperial neo-colonial ambitions of a small ruler of a large country. This proposal is not about Russia alone. It will work for the benefit of all those who are being threatened now or might be threatened later by use of force. Our response should be appropriate and should avert any aggressor from the temptation of starting a war. This is the issue we are resolving today. Mr. President, this proposal is built on the principles of multilateralism, as we call on all states that share the values of the UN Charter to participate in further steps to establish the mechanism. Ukraine is committed to a transparent, impartial, and objective process that will be managed and overseen by the international community in order to avoid even the slightest perception of bias. We have every intention of continuing to cooperate with the United Nations and its bodies in this process. We greatly value and appreciate the invaluable work of the Secretary General and the Commission of Inquiry adopted by the Human Rights Council. We hope for cooperation with UNESCO and UNEP to help assess the damage to the historical and cultural heritage of Ukraine and its environment. A vote against this proposal will be a vote in favor of impunity and lawlessness. A yes vote will mean that there is a faith in international law, that the global architecture so painstakingly built after the Second World War will remain, and the United Nations can stand to watch over international peace and security. It is a signal of hope for justice and an important first step towards accountability, a step towards such wars never happening again. Ukraine is seeking peace. The preconditions for any negotiations outlined by President Zelensky are clear: restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity, compensation for damage caused by the war, prosecution of war criminals. This resolution will bring us closer to this goal, and we must take this leap forward without delay. This session is an opportunity to reflect on this and decide in which world we want to live. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine. I give the floor to His Excellency Mario Adolfo Bucaro Flores, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Guatemala.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting and resuming this 11th Special Emergency Session of the General Assembly of the United Nations. As a follow-up to the impact of the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, once again we meet in order to discuss one of the most important crises at the global level, whose impact is unprecedented. Guatemala was happy to join as co-facilitator and co-sponsor, together with the delegations of Ukraine, Canada, and the Kingdom of the Netherlands, to present to this General Assembly the draft resolution entitled Furtherance of Remedy and Reparation for Aggression against Ukraine, contained in document A/ES/11L6. We have supported and presented this draft resolution based on our own convictions as a country that is profoundly peaceful, but also a country that recognizes that through dialogue, negotiations, reparations, and peaceful means that provided under international law, differences between states can be resolved. We're a country that in our history experienced a long armed conflict, and therefore we acknowledge the importance of peace and respect for human rights. We have presented this draft resolution for the consideration of this honorable General Assembly in the firm belief that this initiative is a step towards reconciliation among the parties. Considering that the resolution includes civilian claims, it's an important step towards peace and post-conflict recovery, and the recommendation of the establishment of a mechanism for the registration of damage and possible reparations. This is a very essential step. As a country that strongly believes in multilateralism, we're convinced that this Honorable General Assembly has the mandate and authority to approve this resolution as set out in Chapter 4 of the United Nations Charter that we have all endorsed. The language of the draft resolution is very carefully drafted so as not to exceed the authority of the General Assembly. This language is based on prior decisions of the General Assembly in the sense that the Russian Federation has committed an act of aggression against Ukraine in violation of Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. With this in mind, we respectfully request all member states to support this initiative because it is the right thing to do, and to vote in favor of this draft resolution for peace around the world. Mr. President, standing here in front of this tribune roster, co-sponsoring this draft resolution, I can't fail to mention the importance of an early reform of the Security Council adapted to modern times. Today, we're considering this draft resolution because the General Assembly cannot remain paralyzed or inactive in the face of the Security Council on this topic and other topics that affect international peace and security, and consequently recognize that humankind requires unity from all of us today. Thank you very much.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Guatemala. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель.
Mr. President, the prominent representative of Ukraine who spoke earlier from this tribune quoted many, but he didn't say the main thing about the resolution, so please allow me to rectify this and cover up this gaffe. The draft resolution which is submitted to the special session is a classic example of a rules-based order wherein a narrow group of states is acting not on the basis of international law, but rather is trying to consecrate something that is illegal and is using for that purpose the authority of the General Assembly, and is positioning the General Assembly as a judicial body, which by definition it is not. And the flawed nature of this initiative is obvious. Legally speaking, the provisions of the draft cannot withstand any criticism. They are legally null and void. They are an attempt to legalize something that, from the view of existing international law, cannot be legalized. At the same time, the co-sponsors of the draft cannot but understand that passing this resolution will lead to consequences which will, like a boomerang, come back to them. These countries boast about how committed they are to the rule of law, but at the same time, they're flouting its very semblance. The draft resolution provides for the creation of a so-called international mechanism for reparation for damage. And then thereafter, it's a technical matter, because this mechanism will be created by a group of countries which themselves will decide how the mechanism is to function. In other words, the General Assembly is suggested that the General Assembly gives a carte blanche to create a body whose features and functioning is something that most of the people present here have no idea about. And these countries will, on their own, determine, or to be more specific, appoint the guilty parties and the amount of damage, the ways to be compensated, etc. The UN will play no role in this process, because the proposed mechanism is suggested to be created outside of the UN, and no one has any plans to account to the General Assembly for its activity. Let me underscore here that most of member states will have no right of vote or any control at the time of establishing the mechanisms or when it's functioning. we have no doubt where the funding for the so-called damage compensation will come from. The West is doing everything it can to provide a veneer of legitimacy for its work so as to start spending the frozen or actual fact stolen Russian Federation assets amounting to billions of dollars. They have for a long time wanted to unfreeze the assets, but not so as to return them to its rightful owner, and not so as to spend them on helping Ukraine, but rather so as to fund their own constantly growing weapon supplies to Kiev and covering the debts for the weapons already supplied. Thereby, the West is trying to draw out and worsen the conflict and plans to use the Russian money for it. And the decision of the General Assembly is needed for that, as a screen to hide this open robbery. Such a development can only increase tension and instability in the entire world, whereas beneficiaries will end up being the Western military corporations. They have already made billions of dollars on weapon supplies to Ukraine. Let me underscore here, neither the General Assembly nor any other mechanism can annul sovereign immunity, which state assets have under international law. The countries which support a General Assembly decision on it will become implicated in illegal expropriation of sovereign assets of a third country and implicated in yet another instance where the GA is exceeding its authorities in the interests of the West. Do the countries of the developing world want to have anything to do with that initiative? We think that most of them think this is ludicrous or even insulting that the Western countries decided to demand reparations rather than pay them out, because the scenarios with the theft and spending of sovereign assets is being put forward by the very states which have a very rich record in looting the rest of the world. And I refer to the centuries of slavery, oppression, colonialism, and neocolonialism, military aggressions and interventions, blockades, unilateral sanctions, and shameless siphoning of natural resources from occupied and oppressed countries. But the proponents of the initiative are trying to make sure everyone forgets that, and they're just pushing the Ukrainian topic forward. The countries of the West never considered reparations as a way of atoning for their own sins. More than that, for 2 decades, they blocked any discussion in the 6th Committee of the General Assembly or the development of any kind of international instrument on the accountability of states for international illegal acts. They've remembered that concept just now when reparations all of a sudden became to their liking as a useful instrument to loot yet another state. If this resolution passes, this will have systemic consequences for the UN, and we call upon member states to realize that and to vote against the draft. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, colleagues, good morning. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, as well as Georgia, Liechtenstein, Monaco, and San Marino align themselves with this statement. Mr. President, the General Assembly is called today to take action on the draft resolution entitled Furtherance of Remedy and Reparation for Aggression against Ukraine. While the title of the resolution explains its purpose and what it intends to achieve, maybe some more background may be useful. I will explain why we believe the resolution is necessary, what it does and what it does not, in order to dispel any misconstructions, including some that we've just heard from this podium. First, why do we support this resolution? The answer is straightforward. Aggression has occurred. On 2nd of March this year, this General Assembly, with an overwhelming majority, confirmed that the Russian Federation committed an aggression against Ukraine in violation of Article 2.4 of the Charter, an internationally wrongful act that hits at the core of the UN system. People around the world are watching as innocent civilians are killed as a result of deliberate targeting, as infrastructure, hospitals, schools, homes are destroyed every day. Destruction is overwhelming. Damage inflicted on Ukraine is huge, and it's only growing bigger with every day that this war rages on. Under international law, the responsible state is under an obligation to make full reparation for the injury caused by its internationally wrongful act. In order to prepare an orderly process, such damage need to be properly registered in the first place. Accountability means that costs move from the victims to the aggressor. There is no question of whether Russia should pay. It's rather a question of when and the amount. Second, what does this resolution do? The resolution merely recommends the creation by member states and Ukraine of a register of damage. That register will serve as a repository of evidence of all types of damage. There are precedents for this, as we all know. The resolution also recognizes the need for the establishment, in cooperation with Ukraine, of an international claims mechanism for reparation for damage as a second step. Rather than charging the domestic legal system of Ukraine and other states with a potentially very high number of individual litigations, a centralized and specialized system would be more appropriate. In our view, an international claims mechanism would provide for legal certainty and procedural fairness. Russia must be held to account for its wrongful acts and wanton destruction. This is key if we are to uphold a rules-based international order. This is not about the West against the rest. This is about global respect for international norms. Third, what does the resolution not do? The resolution does not establish the register of damage, nor does it create the reparation mechanism. These instruments will be created at a later stage by member states in cooperation with Ukraine. There are no costs for the UN system stemming from this resolution, and no costs for anyone else apart from Russia itself, who must bear responsibility for its wrongful acts. Mr. President, we must stay the course in order to shape history. Russia's denial of taking responsibility for destruction and damage adds insult to injury. Let me conclude by saying that every country, regardless of its size, might, or location on the globe, enjoys the right to document crimes committed against its population, territory, environment, or cultural property in order to secure their proper investigation. Each state can also work together with other states or the international community to set up an efficient international mechanism to deal with the reparation claims arising of such crimes. Accordingly, the resolution essentially supports the path to justice. Today it is Ukraine, tomorrow it could be someone else. We therefore call on everyone to vote in favor of this resolution. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea on behalf of the group of like-minded countries.
Good morning. Mr. President, I have the honor to take the floor on behalf of the delegations of Angola, Belarus, Bolivia, Cambodia, China, Cuba, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Iran, the Laos People's Republic, Nicaragua, the State of Palestine, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Syria, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and other like-minded countries. Mr. President, allow us to stress from the very beginning that this General Assembly is not a judicial body, and that its resolutions shall be initiated as stipulated in Article 13 of the Charter of the United Nations for the purpose of promoting international cooperation in the political field and encouraging the progressive development and international law and its codification, and of promoting international cooperation in the economic, social, cultural, educational, and health fields, and assisting in the realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. The resolution adopted by this Assembly, therefore, represent the political will of states and can in no way serve as the legal basis for defining internationally wrongful acts, mindful of the fact that such an action would go beyond its mandate and responsibilities. Mr. President, the draft resolution before us and contained in document A/ES/11L6 on one hand has neither sufficient legal basis nor is it in line with the established practice of the General Assembly, while on the other hand, it would only promote a divisive agenda within this body. In addition, should it be adopted, this draft resolution would set a dangerous precedent that would allow for the blessing of this General Assembly for the establishment of a remedy and reparation mechanism that is neither managed by nor accountable to the very same organ that would be creating it. In this context, we should not forget that colonial powers cause enormous damage and suffering to the peoples of present-day developing states. We also recall detrimental external interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states, including foreign interventions and invasions in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Those states suffering from foreign interference, colonialism, slavery, oppression, unilateral coercive measures, illegal blockades, and other international wrongful acts also deserve the right for remedy, reparation, and justice, which should be addressed through sound legal processes. Mr. President, sovereign states shall not be forced in any way to take specific sides with regards to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Their respective national positions, including those that may decide to remain impartial, should be respected. And we seize this opportunity to stress once again that the conflict around Ukraine must be resolved through diplomatic means and efforts. This General Assembly shall play a positive role towards that end and should spare no effort in favor of its peaceful resolution, while avoiding any initiative that may risk to further aggravate the situation on the ground and to further escalate tensions around the conflict. In this context, we cannot overemphasize that any attempt to entrench a Cold War-era mentality and bloc politics based on confrontation, the deepening divisions, and the imposition of disparate visions and agendas should be rejected by all responsible members of the international community, as it contributes in no way to addressing, through peaceful means and cooperation, the complex, emerging, and common challenges faced nowadays by humanity. To conclude, we would like to stress that all efforts should be made to facilitate and promote friendly relations, dialogue, and cooperation among states in line with the principles, purposes, and values enshrined in both the Charter of the United Nations and the Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states, in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations approved by this General Assembly in its Resolution 2625 of October 24th, 1970. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Eritrea. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Latvia on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, I have the honor to speak on behalf of 8 Nordic Baltic countries: Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Lithuania, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Latvia. Mr. President, February 24th this year, Russia launched its brutal full-scale invasion of Ukraine in blatant violation of international law and the UN Charter. By this war of aggression, aided by Belarus, Russia has deliberately violated the fundamental right of all states to independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Moreover, this aggression has caused immense suffering to the people of Ukraine. It has triggered the largest humanitarian catastrophe in Europe since World War II. More than 17 million people have been displaced. Ukraine has lost more than 40% of its GDP. Today, more than 3 million Ukrainians must get by without water, electricity, sanitation, and heating. Russia's armed forces have deliberately attacked critical civilian infrastructure, including energy grids, power interconnectors, and water stations. Just like other countries, Nordic Baltic countries have been delivering considerable financial, humanitarian, and military assistance to the people of Ukraine. We strongly believe that all member states must seek ways how to support Ukraine. This resolution on furtherance of remedy and reparation for aggression against Ukraine is giving us the possibility to further extend our support to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. With this resolution, General Assembly recognizes the need to establish an international mechanism to compensate Ukraine for the damages caused by Russia's aggression. This resolution recommends the creation of a registry of damages to serve as a record of evidence and claims on damage, loss, and injury caused by the aggression of Russia. We believe it is important to collect and preserve evidence of Russia's brutal aggression against Ukraine, because Russia must be held accountable for its internationally wrongful acts against Ukraine and the Ukrainians. Just a few hours ago, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told journalists that investigators have uncovered more than 400 war crimes in areas of Kherson abandoned by Russian forces as they retreated. There must be no impunity to these crimes or damages caused, and perpetrators must be held to account. In order to achieve this goal, evidence must be properly stored, otherwise it could be potentially lost or damaged. Thus, we support all evidence should be collected and stored in accordance with relevant international norms and standards. Mr. President, the Nordic Baltic countries reiterate our firm support to Ukraine. We are convinced that the respect of international law and the UN Charter and the international rules-based order are fundamental for our common security and multilateral cooperation. We urge Russia to abide by international law and uphold its international commitments. We call for the Secretary General and the UN to continue efforts to restore the respect for the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence of Ukraine. The UN member states must support all mechanisms to restore justice to the victims of Russia's aggression. We therefore call on all UN member states to vote in favor of this resolution. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Latvia on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Poland.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. The Russian aggression against Ukraine requires an ambiguous and comprehensive response from the international community as a whole and from each of its individual members. The UN General Assembly resolution on the furtherance of the remedy and reparation for the aggression against Ukraine gives us a possibility to respond to the numerous horrific and devastating effects of the ongoing war. Mr. President, for almost 9 months, Russia has been attacking Ukraine's civilian population and non-military infrastructure, including those protected by binding international humanitarian law provisions. The scale of material damages perpetrated by Russia and Ukraine is horrendous and not seen in Europe since the Second World War. It is obvious that Russia has flagrantly and manifestly violated a multitude of international obligations. First and foremost, its obligation to respect the prohibition of aggression. Its disrespect for international law is highlighted by non-compliance with the binding decision of the International Court of Justice of 16 March 2022 on provisional measures. Hence, the accountability for the violation of the international law committed in Ukraine by the Russian Federation must remain our priority as the war continues to rage. Russia must bear the consequences of its all violations, including making reparation for the injury and damage caused by such a glaring and large-scale violation of its international obligations. Distinguished delegates, it is fundamental principle of international law that the breach of an obligation involves a duty to redress, in an adequate form, all wrongs, material and non-material, inflicted upon the state and its citizens. Reparation, therefore, is an indispensable complement of a failure to apply international legal rules. Today's resolution recapitulates what is obvious. Russia is under obligation to make full reparation. Poland strongly supports the creation of the International Register of Damages caused by the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine. We strongly believe that all damages need to be always appropriately compensated, no matter when and no matter where they were inflicted. This is a universal guiding principle. It's not enough if the perpetrators only admit their wrongdoings. It's not enough if they express remorse, and in this case, we are even far away from that. Moral gestures are welcomed, but never enough. It is material compensation which is needed to rebuild damages caused by wars. We need to create the registry because it is fundamental for the future of Ukraine. Poland knows only too well from its own history what it means if such actions are forsaken. Mr. President, the proposed register, the operation and modalities of which will be decided among interested states, will not only assist Ukraine in rebuilding itself after the devastating war, but more importantly, it will bring justice to the victims of the Russian barbaric acts, such as a mass killing of men, women and children, torture, sexual violence or forced deportation. It should also not be forgotten, as Poland stressed in the Security Council in May, that apart from the human casualties, the Russian aggression keeps causing destruction to the cultural sites in Ukraine. Religious sites, historic buildings, monuments, Holocaust memorials, and other artifacts are being damaged and looted on a daily basis. Addressing the General Assembly in September this year, President of Poland, Andrzej Duda, stressed Poland's commitment to all accountability efforts by stating, and I quote, "I would like from this place to pledge our support to all existing and new initiatives so that those who deprive millions of people of their right to food and destroy the environment will no longer go unpunished. In the face of Russia's unlawful actions, we should all learn a lesson for the future." Mr. President, as the international community was unable to prevent the ongoing Russian aggression, it is our duty to advocate towards ensuring accountability for atrocities committed against Ukraine. It is thus imperative to support today's resolution, as it will constitute the first step towards reparation for injury and damage caused by the Russian aggression and lead us towards achieving peace and post-conflict recovery. And I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Poland. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, I thank you for the honor of granting me the floor to express a few views with regard to the caution we should exercise in acting on a resolution which I say borders on the fringes of misadventure if we were to act upon it in the way we are called to do so. Mr. President, Sri Lanka remains deeply concerned regarding the deteriorating situation in Ukraine resulting from the ongoing hostilities. As a country that suffered from a 30-year-old internal conflict, Sri Lanka affirms the truism that wars no longer end with winners or losers. Wars, as someone said, distinguished delegates, are easier to start than to stop. Look around us. How are wars won in contemporary times? Look around us. Haven't they ended indecisively? They have. Every one of them have ended indecisively. It has today become much more difficult to relate military success to political stability, which is an indispensable ingredient for peace. Mr. President, since the eruption of hostilities in Ukraine in February this year, we have seen hostile rhetoric, strategic maneuvering, and repeated closure of doors to any possible settlement of the conflict, thus relegating the humanitarian crisis and resulting suffering to the back burner. We are suicidal in our tendencies, quite frankly. We like to play with fire to our detriment. The consequences are evident to the whole world, which was already beset by the devastating effect of a pandemic and is now facing a severe energy and food crisis that has devastated economies and livelihoods around the world. Those in the developing world, like Sri Lanka, with vulnerable economies, dependent on services, mechanisms such as tourism, have been specially hard hit. All this is happening amidst multiple other challenges referred to by the Secretary General himself as a 5-alarm global fire, as he describes it. Mr. President, the vast majority of countries represented in this assembly have not invaded other countries or colonized them, nor have they engaged in proxy wars in countries far away from their own. However, we in Sri Lanka have been forced to suffer the consequences of an Easter bombing, an unknown pandemic followed by a war in the Ukraine, the cumulative effects of which have dealt our economies and countries similar to us a body blow, causing our economies to hemorrhage. That is the plight that we are in. Mr. President, Sri Lanka is of the view that the most urgent step, therefore, is to engage in talks continue to engage in talks for a ceasefire, to end the conflict and alleviate the humanitarian suffering. That is of paramount importance. The attempt to provide justification through a General Assembly resolution for seizure of sovereign assets of one party at this juncture, in our respectful view, is misconceived and misplaced and would amount to an overreach of the application of the provisions of the Charter and an engagement in what I would describe as being jurisprudential gymnastics, choreographed intrinsically by a misplaced composition of misunderstood sequences, a misadventure that can go terribly wrong, my dear friends. A simple reading of the Charter provisions makes it abundantly clear that such a mechanism was never, ever contemplated by the draftsman of the Charter. It can also result in setting a precedent, as observed by by the ambassador for Eritrea. The General Assembly setting a precedent wherein the General Assembly does not have the competency to pronounce upon. What we ask are the parameters of such a mechanism. What are the outer parameters of the mechanism? Will it also apply to conflicts in other parts of the world, which have been lingering for much longer? Ask yourselves that question. Have these conflicts ended? Have we exhausted our best efforts to bring the conflict to an end by a pacific settlement of the disputes as envisaged by the provisions of the Charter? Distinguished delegates, think about it. Moreover, the General Assembly by its very nature is a political body for deliberation and entrusted to make political recommendations to its membership through consensus or otherwise. Distinguished delegates, the General Assembly cannot determine state responsibility or usurp the sovereign immunity of state property under international law. It cannot arrogate to itself the role of an adjudicatory tribunal. This move, therefore, creates a dangerous precedent which leaves room for any group of countries based on existing power dynamics to lay the groundwork to seize sovereign assets without any basis in international law, further aggravating the already existing mistrust and suspicion. Distinguished delegates, Mr. President, reparations by their very nature include 5 key components: cessation, assurances of non-repetition, restitution and repatriation, compensation, satisfaction, and rehabilitation. Why do countries, ask yourself the question, why do countries pay reparations? War reparations, distinguished delegates, are compensation payments made after a war by one side to the other. It is a levy on a defeated country, forcing it to pay some of the war costs of the winning country. That's what it is for. Is it the case that this war has conclusively ended? Is that the case? Isn't that far from the case? We sincerely wish it was, even indecisively. Mr. President, we are therefore of the considered view that this initiative will not only exacerbate the conflict, but might well result in compelling the parties to resort to a more lethal and sophisticated method of prosecuting the conflict that none of us would wish to see. We must take every care that we do not reach that point, the point of no return. Distinguished delegates, we must continue our efforts of diplomatic engagement at the highest level and desist from any activity or support to either party of whatever nature that would enable them to sustain military operations further. Distinguished delegates, however, sadly, there seems to be no forward movement in this regard, and steps being contemplated, such as this one, will only widen the existing fissures that would entail in a multiply effect globally, which will have to be borne by all of us, including by those member states who are not even remotely connected, I say, to this conflict, and by generations to come. Mr. President, the greatest glory, someone said, in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. And it is time we got together and may put an end to this conflict by using our diplomatic means. For these reasons, Sri Lanka respectfully requests that this August Assembly does not exacerbate the conflict and engage in any activity which are not in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia on behalf of the Gulf Cooperation Council.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to deliver this statement on behalf of the member states of the Cooperation Council for the Arab States of the Gulf, United Arab Emirates, Kingdom of Bahrain, Sultanate of Oman, State of Qatar, State of Kuwait, and my country, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The Gulf Cooperation Council GCC countries follow with great concern the current state of affairs in the Republic of Ukraine and the ongoing crisis. We're also following with great concern the humanitarian, economic and political consequences. GCC countries stress that their positions are in line with their fundamental principles of the respect of the international law and Charter of the United Nations, which govern the relations between countries. This must be based on the respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries. GCC countries reaffirm the friendly relations they have with all the parties of this conflict. Mr. President, GCC countries urge all parties to respect their obligations as per the international law. They firmly believe that the best course to avoid the adverse consequences is to reach a settlement for this conflict by diplomatic means in order to serve the interests of all parties. Therefore, GCC countries urge all other parties to exercise restraint and avoid any further escalation, as well as resort to peaceful means to resolve this conflict. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the resolution before us today in the document A/ES 11/L6 is a resolution that is based on the main principles and guidelines of redress and reparations adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations in its resolution number 147/60 of 2005. GCC countries believe that any mechanism that is developed must be based on procedures and standards that are internationally accepted and are under the auspices of the United Nations. This is to provide redress and reparation in a fair manner that ensures achieving the objectives sought. To conclude, Mr. President, GCC countries express their hope that we will continue to work to find a satisfactory solution. GCC countries will continue to support all humanitarian and political initiatives to achieve this purpose. The purpose is to bring peace to the region and spare the world from the adverse consequences of this crisis on the humanitarian, political, and economic levels. And thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia on behalf of the Gulf Cooperation Council. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. Russia's unprovoked and illegal invasion of Ukraine, including its attacks on civilians, schools, hospitals, and power supplies, has caused and continues to cause immense damage and loss to Ukraine and its people. In contrast, the scenes of relief and joy we have seen as Ukrainian civilians in Kherson greet the liberating armed forces of Ukraine should leave us in no doubt at the cruel and destructive nature of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It will take a broad international effort to support Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction in order to build a safe and prosperous future for the Ukrainian people. But only one country, Russia, is responsible for the damage to Ukraine, and it is absolutely right, as this resolution sets out, that Russia pay for that damage. Russia must be held to account for actions which are in clear violation of international law, including the UN Charter. The United Kingdom supports Ukraine's ambition to establish a register of damage to ensure that the evidence of the destruction caused by Russia is documented and preserved. This is an important first step in Ukrainian efforts to seek justice in accordance with international law. It is right that we begin that process now. Putin must end his war of choice, end the lies and distortion, end the global devastation in its wake, and withdraw his troops from Ukraine. We remain steadfast in our support for Ukraine and for justice and compensation for the damage that Russia has caused. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Mr. President, more than 8 months after Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the situation is still extremely dire. We again condemn Russia's aggression. Russia has inflicted tremendous damage on Ukraine, including the killing of innocent civilians and the destruction of civil infrastructure and facilities, such as schools, museums, and commercial establishments. Japan has already resumed embassy operations in Kyiv, and we are mindful of such damage on the ground. We recall that indiscriminate attacks on innocent civilian populations constitute a war criminal, and responsibility for these actions must be held. Mr. President, unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force must not occur in any corner of the globe. This resolution should contribute to the reparations for the serious violations of the principles of the United Nations Charter. Russia must immediately stop its war of aggression, withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from Ukraine, and respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
Mr. President, Aotearoa New Zealand welcomes the opportunity to speak on this important matter. Aotearoa New Zealand continues to be gravely concerned by the loss of life, displacement, destruction, and economic calamity caused by the Russian Federation's blatant aggression against Ukraine over the last 9 months. Consistent with the UN Charter, and as members of the General Assembly, it is our responsibility to do all we can to avoid the deadly consequences of war. We see accountability and reparation processes as an important element in avoiding and forestalling further perpetuation of grave atrocities. Aotearoa New Zealand is strongly committed to supporting international mechanisms that seek accountability for Russia's clear breaches of international law. We continue these efforts through New Zealand's intervention in Ukraine's case against Russia in the International Court of Justice, as well as through the making of significant financial contributions to the International Criminal Court. In addition to mechanisms that seek accountability, we believe that future reparation processes can play a critical role in the rebuilding of communities. Those that are responsible for causing damage and injury by breaching international law must make full reparations for rebuilding and compensating Ukraine. Aotearoa New Zealand strongly supports Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and unequivocally condemns Russia's aggression. The principles at stake in Ukraine are deeply significant to New Zealand as a small state acting in the world. We continue to call on Russia to commit to dialogue, to act in the interests of peace and principles of the United Nations, and to act consistently with its responsibilities as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. We stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of New Zealand. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Mr. President, Vietnam continues to closely follow the situation in Ukraine. We are extremely concerned over the recent developments with a few prospects for an early resolution. Our position has been clear and consistent. The immediate priority now must be an immediate cessation of hostilities, restoration of peace, and protecting the safety and security of civilians and civilian facilities in Ukraine. In this regard, Vietnam welcomes efforts by the UN and the international community for their untiring efforts in helping bringing all parties together and for continued implementation of concluded agreements. We cannot let cooperation and dialogue take the back seat. We continue to call on concerned parties to resume dialogue and negotiation so as to achieve long-term solutions that take into consideration the interests and concerns of all parties in accordance with international law and the UN Charter. Nothing should be more desirable than the regional and international peace, security, and stability so awaited by the people. Mr. President, wars and conflicts across continents continue unabated, posing direct threats to millions of lives. Underdevelopment and poverty are also the consequences of deep-rooted historical ramifications of wars. After decades of war, struggling for independence and defending our independence with untold losses, Vietnam fully understands the utmost importance of preserving the war legacies for reconstruction, maintenance of peace, stability, and prosperity for the livelihoods of the people. At the same time, we believe that in all conflicts, it is crucial that concerned parties and international partners should make utmost efforts to practically contribute to alleviate the destruction of war in accordance with international law. Mr. President, pending a final solution for the situation in Ukraine, the immediate task is responding adequately to the urgent humanitarian need of those impacted by the hostilities in the country. International assistance is critical. To that end, we must continue join hands to create a conducive and people-centered environment and refrain from actions that may drive the parties further apart and delay the prospects of settlement. Vietnam commends operation by the UN, international partners, and regional countries to assist people on the ground, including refugees. We stand ready to constructively contribute to diplomatic efforts to the reconstruction and restoration in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. Let us remember that on the 2nd of March, under the Uniting for Peace formula, the international community stood together and adopted Resolution ES-11/1 by an overwhelming majority. In doing so, we were united in deploring in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine in violation of Article 2.4 of the Charter. It's now more than 8 months on, and every day Russia's invasion of Ukraine unleashes further suffering, causing death, injury and destruction in Ukraine. When this illegal and immoral war ends, Ukraine will face the monumental task of rebuilding all that was destroyed by Russia in the context of or during its invasion. The injuries suffered by Ukraine as a result of Russia's violations of international law require full reparation by Russia in accordance with international law of state responsibility. Article 31 of the International Law Commission's articles on the responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts makes abundantly clear that, and I quote, "The responsible state is under an obligation to make full reparation for the injury caused by the internationally wrongful act." End quote. This fundamental principle of international law is not controversial. Far from it. In fact, in a decision in February of this year, the International Court of Justice once again explicitly reaffirmed that Article 31 and this principle represents customary international law. So let us be clear. The international community has overwhelmingly spoken to condemn Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine as a violation of the UN Charter. There is no doubt that Russia has an obligation under international law to make full reparation for the injury caused by this egregious and legally wrongful act. The resolution we're debating today, which Australia is proud to co-sponsor, recognises these basic facts and that Russia must be held to account for its illegal and immoral invasion of Ukraine. We will not be fooled by Russia's misinformation and obfuscation. This resolution does not overstep the powers of the General Assembly in any way. It simply recognises fundamental principles of international law by which Russia, and we must all, abide. A register of damage and a reparations mechanism, appropriately constructed, would be important components of a fair, impartial and just framework for reaching a view of the reparations Russia must make to ensure lasting peace. Colleagues, the international community must work together to start laying the foundations now. We must first accurately record the damage caused by Russia with a view to achieving peace and post-conflict recovery. We must urge all member states to continue to support this resolution and every effort to ensure Russia complies with its obligations under international law, including to end its war of aggression against Ukraine and to make reparations for the injury and damage it has already caused. Thank you, colleagues.
I thank the distinguished representative of Australia. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Albania.
Mr. President, for 9 long months, the unprovoked and unjustified military aggression of Russia in Ukraine, otherwise unavoidable disaster imposed by Kremlin, has caused devastating consequences. Thousands of innocent people have been killed, millions have been displaced, vast parts of the country have been destroyed. Nothing has been spared. Russian bombs and missiles, lately with help from Iran and North Korea, have, in blatant disregard of international law, targeted Ukraine's economy, its infrastructure, its education and health care, its culture, religious, historic, and archaeological sites. The Russian footprint of destruction is everywhere. Every time Russia has been pushed back, and this is happening continuously since months now, we have seen relentless punishing bombardments seeking to wreck Ukraine's infrastructure, provoke a power grid collapse, halting water and sewage services, making life impossible, with the hope to freeze the country into submission. This is appalling, but it is not news in a war, in this war of aggression. The news is that Russian cruelty has not sapped Ukraine's will to fight. The retreat from Kherson is just the latest act of the Russian humiliation saga in Ukraine. Yes, there is no electricity in Kherson. There is no water, there is no light, there is no heating, and there is no internet there. But most importantly, there is no Russia there anymore, only its terrible footprint. Colleagues, the UN and other organizations have reported continuously on the significant and widespread damages caused by this aggression. But there is need to have a detailed map of what has happened, to have a full picture of this man-made catastrophe. What we know already is staggering. According to serious and credible reports, over 7% of Ukraine's entire housing stock has been destroyed. The damage inflicted to transporter infrastructure, roads and railroads, amounts to close 1/3 of the entire country. More than 300 bridges have been deliberately destroyed by Russia since February this year. 1,270 schools have been damaged or destroyed, along with close to 1,000 healthcare facilities. Business and industry properties have sustained close to $10 billion in damage. But this is far from being the full picture. Colleagues, actions have consequences, and Russia must be held accountable, including for reparations. It is one of the core principles of the international law that the aggressor has an obligation to make full reparation for the damages it has caused. This is why Albania fully supports the resolution presented today for furtherance of remedy and reparation of aggression against Ukraine, and call on all member states here present to vote in favor of this draft resolution as an act of justice and dignity. It is very straightforward. An aggression has happened. Extensive damage has been inflicted. It needs to be documented for the purpose of reparation and accountability. This is all this text is about. Colleagues, this war, just like every war, will stop one day. It must stop now, since every day going on, the toll will be heavier for all, including for Russia itself, which, let's not forget, has become the first G20 economy decoupled completely from Europe, with a very bleak, spiraling downturn outlook. It is a self-inflicted pain. This is why it is time for Russia to silence the guns, withdraw completely and unconditionally from Ukraine, and engage into negotiations. Ukraine is home to Ukrainians. It doesn't have to become the graveyard of the Russian soldiers. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Albania. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's an honor for me to be able to represent my country, Canada, and to say clearly that there are things that have been said about this resolution which, frankly, have nothing to do with the resolution. So I think it's important to underscore and emphasize the principles and the words that we have used in the resolution, because they're very clear and, frankly, have nothing to do with words we heard from some delegates on this.
Important that we recall the words of a wise philosopher who said, there's a difference between saying something and proving something. So when someone says that this resolution is about the forcible seizure of assets and about the destruction of the powers of sovereign states, it's not true. That's not what the resolution says. That's not what the resolution does. The resolution is very short. It's only a page and a half. You can read it. Everyone can read it for themselves. And you can see that the words seizure of sovereign assets occur nowhere in the resolution. This is nothing about the seizure of sovereign assets. And the country that is making these allegations is making them because they don't want to admit what the resolution actually says. Because it's very simple. The resolution says, after all of the operative parts which refer to previous resolutions, refer to previous decisions which the Assembly has made, the resolution simply says that we recognize the need for the establishment in cooperation with Ukraine of an international mechanism for reparation for damage, loss, or injury, and that we recommend the creation by member states in cooperation with Ukraine of an international register of damage to serve as a record in documentary form of evidence and claims information on damage, loss, or injury to all natural and legal persons concerned. And then that's what it says. Those are the two operative paragraphs of the resolution. And some of the delegates who've spoken have been talking about something completely different. Some of what I hear today is a cry. And the cry is, we are hurting. We are hurting because of the cascade of crises and calamities that have occurred in the world in the last 5 years, several years. And we don't want there to be any distractions from our calamities. I think any caring, empathetic, compassionate person who heard these words would say, I understand, I hear you. And there have been pleas from many delegates to say we should be paying attention to the humanitarian concerns and to the humanitarian issues on the ground, and we should be striving for peace. Who can disagree with that? Canada has been spending hundreds of millions of dollars on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. And we say that not to say we're better than anyone else, but we're saying it because, of course, we respond to the humanitarian situation. But do not let us be distracted from what is actually in this resolution. It is not in any way an excess of powers of the General Assembly, because the only reason the General Assembly is dealing with this situation in Ukraine is because the Russian Federation has vetoed each and every attempt in the Security Council to deal with this crisis. In other words, the party that is committing the aggression, and we've said on numerous occasions in this assembly that there has been an aggression and that it is an attack on the territorial integrity of Ukraine. We've said that twice in clear and emphatic resolutions, and we've gone further and said that there were annexations that were further illegal. And now all we're saying is, please recommend that we allow Ukraine to set up a registry and that other countries can join in supporting the registry which is not about seizing assets or dealing with state sovereignty in any way, shape, or form, but is about saying there has to be a registry in order for there to be an eventual reckoning for the damage and destruction that has been caused. Sometimes we're too gentle in describing this situation. One of my colleagues today from this podium described it, the events of February 24th, as an eruption of hostilities, as if a volcano had gone off. Except this was not a volcano. This was an attack by one country on another country. And under our rules here, they're in the charter, when one country attacks another country, it's a breach of the law. It's against the rules. And one would have thought that the Security Council would have been able to say that. But no, because the Russian Federation, which was the party that perpetrated the attack, prevented the Security Council from functioning and has tried to tie up this Assembly and the Security Council in knots because it can't bring itself to admit that its so-called special military operation is not a special military operation, it's a systematic attack on Ukraine, on the Ukrainian people, and on Ukrainian infrastructure. Why did the Russian Federation wait until the autumn to begin its massive bombing of the civilian infrastructure of Ukraine? Because winter follows the autumn. That's why. It was an attempt to freeze and to starve the people of Ukraine. And people talk anxiously here about we need to find peace. Of course we need to find peace. The one country that can create peace is the country that refuses to allow the Security Council to do its job, refuses to allow the Assembly to do its job, and refuses to accept responsibility for its own act of aggression. This is a permanent member of the Security Council that is supposed to be acting as a steward and guardian of the Charter. There's nothing excessive in the resolution. In fact, the resolution is modest in the extreme. The Assembly is not being asked to perform a function as a judge or jury. It's not being asked to exceed its jurisdiction. It's not being asked to go too far. It's simply saying there should be a registry, and Ukraine and other countries that are willing to support it should be allowed to support a registry. Why and how this is an excess of jurisdiction cannot be explained. And all of the things that have been said in the letter from the Russian ambassador to all of us, and all have been said today from this podium about how this is some systematic Western plot to steal the assets of sovereign states, is just complete balderdash. It's nonsense. And we have to have the courage to say it. This is not some magical event that occurred out of the air that has no explanation, that has no cause and no effect. It has a cause. That cause is called aggression. It has an effect. That effect is the destruction of life, liberty, property in a country called Ukraine, which is a real place, which is a real country. And like all countries and all members of this Assembly, it deserves support. And we're not doing it for Ukraine alone. There are member states here said this is all very far away. It has nothing to do with us. Well, I'm sorry. The crimes that are committed against the least of us are the crimes that are committed against all of us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the distinguished representative of Canada. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovakia.
Mr. President, Slovakia fully aligns itself with the statement made earlier by the distinguished representative of the European Union, and I wish to add just a few remarks in my national capacity. The context of today's debate is indeed self-explanatory. Slovakia considers the resolution in front of us another important step towards ensuring accountability of Russia for its continuing unfortunate, unprovoked, and unjustified military aggression against Ukraine in violation of all fundamental values and principles of the UN Charter and international law upon which this organization is built and upon which we work and we believe in. Under customary international law, the state responsible for the international wrongful act is under obligation to cease that act if continuing and to offer appropriate assurances and guarantees of non-repetition if circumstances so require. Importantly, the responsible state is further obliged to make full reparation for the injury caused by the internationally wrongful act. This is just a reminder of all of us of this important international law context. The General Assembly has already confirmed in its resolution ES 11/1 of the 2nd of March that the Russian aggression against Ukraine is indeed in violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. That resolution also demanded Russia to cease this internationally wrongful act by immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal of all its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Today, we have an opportunity to address the second obligation of Russia stemming from its continuing violations of international law. We have already heard what the resolution in front of us seeks and does not seek to do. I will therefore not repeat it, but rather appeal to all delegations in this room with one simple question. Imagine that your neighbor launches and relentlessly continues a brutal and illegitimate military aggression, acting thus in contravention of your right to sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. What is more, your neighbor causes enormous, and I have to underline, enormous and unbelievable material and moral damage to your country and, what is more, to your people. We see this taking place daily in Ukraine. In such a situation, would you not want the international community to recognize that the aggressor state must be held to account and that it has the obligation to make full reparation? I believe the answer is clear, and Slovakia strongly encourages all states to vote in line with the legal but also moral imperative today. It is, dear colleagues, indeed our collective responsibility. We will do so on our end. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Slovakia. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Mr. President, Italy aligns itself to the statement delivered by the European Union and wishes to add some remarks in its national capacity. Despite the many strong condemnations of Russia's illegal and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine, overwhelmingly voiced by this General Assembly, Russia's violent actions continue to cause suffering and destruction on a large scale. Russia must be held accountable for such suffering and destruction. Since the beginning, Russia's war of aggression deliberately targeted also civilians and civilian infrastructures in order to cause great harm to the people of Ukraine. The picture that is emerging after Russia's recent withdrawal from Kherson is once again one of destruction and pain inflicted on the local population. The present resolution does not establish any standing UN reparation or compensation mechanism. It is instead aimed at providing global legitimacy by recommending to member states the creation of an international register of damage. Such register of damages will coordinate and organize evidence-gathering efforts, including those carried out in the context of various investigations by UN bodies. Such register will make sure that the collected evidence will be properly organized, recorded, and properly used in legal proceedings. Reparation for civil claims, as well as for Russia's internationally wrongful acts, is not only a fundamental obligation under international law, it is also an essential step towards achieving peace and post-conflict recovery, as well as for the future reintegration of the aggressor state in the community of peace-loving nations as laid down in Article 4 of the UN Charter. Reparations related to damages caused by Russia's wrongful acts are meant to bring justice to the victims for death, injury, torture, deportation, forced displacement. Italy is proud co-sponsor of this draft resolution. I call on all member states to support justice, reconstruction, and reconciliation by voting yes to this resolution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Italy. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ireland aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of the European Union and makes the following additional remarks in its national capacity. Once again, Ireland strongly condemns the Russian Federation's unprovoked, unjustified and illegal further invasion of Ukraine. It is in flagrant violation of the UN Charter as confirmed by this General Assembly. Once again, this Assembly meets while civilians in Ukraine bear the consequences of Russia's actions. These include attacks against residential buildings and the deliberate destruction of critical civilian infrastructure, including some 40% of Ukraine's electricity supply capacity. In addition, incidents of enforced disappearances, torture, and conflict-related sexual violence committed by Russian soldiers continue to be documented. Ireland once again urges the Russian Federation to comply with its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We repeat our call on Russia to immediately end its invasion of Ukraine, to withdraw its forces from the entire territory of Ukraine, and to return to the path of dialogue and diplomacy before any more of Ukraine's people are forced to pay the terrible price of this appalling war. Mr. President, notwithstanding the previous resolutions of this body, and in complete disregard of the provisions of the UN Charter, Russia persists in its unashamed and unlawful aggression against Ukraine. There are legal consequences for the Russian Federation arising from its continued breaches of international law. Russia is under obligation to cease its internationally wrongful acts and to make reparations for the injury caused by those acts. The resolution before us today recognises and affirms those clear obligations. Ireland, therefore, supports the recommendation for the establishment of an international register of damage. Such a register of damage would preserve evidence of the damage, loss and injury that has been inflicted upon Ukraine and its people by Russia, creating an essential resource for future and ongoing accountability efforts. A register is also important for a historical record, to shed light on the atrocities, international crimes and human rights violations committed against the people of Ukraine. The proposed register would be an important first step towards accountability in order to provide justice for victims and survivors. The establishment of a register would represent the beginning of a process that can ultimately lead to the payment of reparations in accordance with international law. Reparations will alleviate some of the devastating long-term physical and financial consequences of this horrific war for the Ukrainian people. We urge all members of this General Assembly to vote in favour of the resolution tabled here today. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ireland. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, my delegation aligns itself with the statement delivered by the distinguished representative of Eritrea on behalf of like-minded countries, and we make the following in our national capacity. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, it has become clear that Western countries are insisting to promote the political polarization within the United Nations, to deepen the divide among member states. They continue to call for holding such meetings, such sessions, which only serve the hostile agenda of Western countries against the Russian Federation. The Syrian Arab Republic would like to stress that settling international and regional crises and disputes cannot take place through deception, cannot take place through the policies of isolation, marginalization, and sanctions, and cannot take place by establishing politicized mechanisms. This can only happen through diplomacy and dialogue. We also stress that the General Assembly should avoid any initiative which could exacerbate the conflict and prevent its peaceful resolution. The escalating conflict between Russia and Ukraine is attributed to the instigation by Western states of extremist nationalism in Ukraine. They continue to instigate neo-Nazis and provide them with different weapons and equipment with no limit. This is a threat to regional security and safety. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the draft resolution before the General Assembly today is part of a series of unbalanced, biased, and provocative resolutions pushed by the United States and its Western partners to target the Russian Federation. This draft resolution is a dangerous case of hostility, namely by seizing the Russian sovereign funds and assets which are frozen. This sets a precedent by establishing an illegitimate mechanism for reparation, which is not in the purview of the General Assembly at the UN. The failed attempts by such countries to subjugate the Russian Federation have led them to resort to yet another blackmailing tactic against the Russian Federation. They decided to loot the frozen funds through the so-called mechanism for reparation and helping the Ukrainian people. However, the real objective here is to pay for the growing purchases of weapons by Ukraine from Western countries. The General Assembly is manipulating the rules of procedure at the UN. It is imposing new, illegitimate, unprecedented mechanisms through pressure and blackmail. This has become the new practice of Western countries in their attempt to target member states which do not go along with their political agendas. Mr. President, the policy of double standards, so the double standards by Western countries, mean that they focus on issues that serve their agendas, while at the same time they avoid their responsibility for the unlawful acts they have perpetrated in past decades against a number of member states in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This is an attempt to avoid accountability for the grave harm they have inflicted upon such countries, including my country, the Syrian Arab Republic. For this reason, the draft resolution today, which suggests the establishment of such a mechanism, is yet another illustrious example of the political hypocrisy, the unprecedented political hypocrisy we are seeing today. This begs the question: who will actually compensate my country? Who will provide reparation for my country for the destruction of the Syrian infrastructure by the so-called international coalition led by the United States and its Western partners? Who will provide reparation for the Syrian people for looting their national wealth, for the grave losses they have suffered from the inhumane, unilateral, coercive sanctions imposed on us for the past decade? No one actually asks this question. Mr. President, based on our principled solution and our firm position in rejecting all attempts to politicize the work of the United Nations, we will vote against the draft resolution, and we urge member states to be careful from playing along and establishing illegal, illegitimate mechanisms that do not go along with the prerogatives of the General Assembly and the provisions of the Charter, and which will only create further chaos in international relations. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nicaragua.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, we would echo the statement made by Eritrea on behalf of like-minded countries. We once again find ourselves in this General Assembly facing the hypocrisy and the double standards of certain countries who have presented initiatives that exclusively seek to promote their selfish, narrow agendas that do not benefit or contribute to multilateralism or to the inclusivity of the membership of the United Nations. Nicaragua is in favor of strengthening a robust multilateralism, promoting a culture of peace, a new international order with deep transformations in the relations between countries, with new centers of development and hope that represent the largest part of humankind. It's important to take the final step towards a multipolar world that strengthens sovereignty and international law, the right to an independent development, and that at last puts an end to double standards. Nicaragua reiterates its commitment to respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the security of all countries. Member states must fully comply with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. Mr. President, the draft resolution contained in document A/ES-11/L6 shamelessly seeks to manipulate and politicize our organization by recommending the establishment of this international reparations mechanism that would not be administered by the body that establishes it. The presentation of this selective resolution by certain countries highlights the interests and the double standards that Western countries seek to impose on us by establishing a reparations mechanism for a very specific case and completely ignoring the painful history that their imperialist occupations and colonialism left in their wake, the conquest, the extermination and looting of hundreds of nations and original peoples. Slavery and the genocide of original peoples were and continue to be a crime against humanity that has no precedent in the history of the world, and the reparations to which the original peoples are entitled to, including Africans and Afro-descendants that are victims of this barbarity, continue to be a pending debt that the countries of Europe and the United States refuse to honor. Western countries do not recognize the greatest genocide committed against our original peoples that destroyed entire cultures. We would join and fully support the demands of our brethren states of the Caribbean and Africa for reparations that they've demanded and that Western countries continue to ignore. Mr. President, the imposition of sanctions, unilateral coercive measures, are direct aggressions against our peoples, and at a time of pandemic, they become crimes against humanity. And in this case, they should also be the subject of reparations for all the peoples that are victims of the damage caused by these aggressions by Western countries. We cannot fail to recall the double morals. This is this constant double standard practiced by the West. On the 27th of June of 1986, the historical decision of the International Court of Justice of The Hague condemned the United States for military and paramilitary activities in and against Nicaragua, and decided to compensate Nicaragua for an amount of $17 billion. This is a decision that the United States has not complied with, thus denigrating the United Nations and the highest international court. Mr. President, in these days, the Climate Change COP27 is taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh. For decades, our developing countries have demanded a reparations mechanism to compensate for our losses and damage caused by the negative impact of climate change. And what is taking place at the COP27? Once again, Western countries who implement and expand destructive capitalist models of production and consumption, destroying our Mother Earth, and who bear these historical responsibilities, are refusing to establish a reparations mechanism for the climate crisis, which we have not provoked, but that we suffer from with greatest intensity and frequency every single day. Mr. President, to conclude, Draft Resolution A/ES-11/L6 is a divisive act in this General Assembly. It does not promote dialogue or establish conditions for a diplomatic solution. It is a dangerous precedent that will have unimaginable repercussions for international peace and security, because this mechanism would not be administered or be under the jurisdiction of our General Assembly. This is incongruous and does not contribute anything to peace or the resolution of the conflict in Ukraine. Therefore, Mr. President, Nicaragua will vote against this draft resolution. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nicaragua. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Romania.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, Romania joined the European Union statement, and I would like to add a few comments in my national capacity. We are well aware of the context of this new debate under the 11th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly. Despite the repeated calls of this UN body, the Russian Federation continues unabated its unjustified and unprovoked illegal military aggression against Ukraine. The resolution before us is an additional step towards accountability for the blatant violations of international law committed by the Russian Federation in Ukraine. Its provisions seek to complement the existing international efforts related to individual criminal responsibility by adding the missing dimension, the dimension of a state's responsibility for its internationally wrongful acts. It is well established that legal consequences of an internationally wrongful act are the obligations of the responsible state to cease the wrongful conduct and to make full reparation for the injury caused. And this is the basic premise upon which this text is built. The case for reparations for Ukraine should benefit from the legitimacy of the most representative organ of the United Nations, not only because it represents a moral and a legal imperative, but also because it constitutes an important deterrent to the benefit of the entire international community. We have said it before, and we will say it again. If the aggressor is left unsanctioned, it could lead to an irreversible decay of the international order many generations have strived to build in the aftermath of the devastating world wars to ensure the lasting reign of peace. This Assembly knows from legitimate and credible sources that the extent of damage and suffering caused by the aggression against Ukraine is immense. Recognizing that there is a need for an international mechanism for reparation, recommending the creation of an international register of damage is a modest and principled step. The provisions of this resolution do not establish any new entities. With the full agreement that time is of the essence and that evidence of the damage should be documented, we have trust that the future steps of this process will take into account the need for inclusivity and transparency, and that the future register of damage and potential reparations mechanism will be impartial and firmly rooted in the principles of independence and non-discrimination, and that they will complement the existing national and international evidence-gathering efforts. Romania will vote in favor of this text and hopes that the result will prove our collective commitment to all international accountability efforts in support of Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Romania. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, the root cause of the crisis in Ukraine totally lies in the hegemonic policy of the United States and West, which have systematically undermined the security environment in Europe by by ignoring reasonable and just demand of the Russian Federation for security concern and promoting eastward expansion of NATO. The draft resolution entitled Furtherance of the Remedy and Aspiration of the Aggression against Ukraine is nothing more than politically motivated document to shift all responsibility of the crisis in Ukraine to the Russian Federation. Furthermore, that draft resolution is inconsistent with the proposed principle of the UN Charter for settlement of the international dispute by peaceful means and in accordance with the principle of justice and international law. The General Assembly is not a judicial organ, and thus it has no mandate to judge internationally lawful act and provide the legal ground for remedy and aspiration of certain country. General Assembly must play constructive role in preventing further escalation of geopolitical confrontation and tension and addressing security concern of parties to conflict in a reasonable and balanced manner. The DPRK delegation expressed its deep concern to the possibility of abusing this draft resolution as a legal basis to illegally seize property and assets of sovereign state. With regard to this issue, I would like to mention the resolution entitled United Nations Convention on Jurisdictional Immunity of State and Their Property, which was adopted at the 59th session of the General Assembly in 2004. Although this UN Convention has not yet come into the force due to lack of the sufficient deposits of the instrument of the ratification, all UN member states have reached the consensus that any state enjoy immunity in respect of its property away from jurisdiction of court of others. The text of this convention originated in deliberation of the International Law Commission and was elaborated by ad hoc committee reporting to 6th Committee of the General Assembly. This means that jurisdictional immunity of the state and their property is internationally recognized customary law, and no one can violate this immunity. From this point of view, the delegation of DPRK opposed draft resolution submitted to current session as a product of the unilateral and double standard practice that infringe upon interest of sovereign state. I think.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. President, China associates itself with the statement made by Eritrea on behalf of the group of like-minded countries. Mr. President, remedy and reparation are important ways to deliver justice, offer consolation, and promote reconstruction after war and conflict. Victimized by numerous foreign aggressions in modern history, China has endured immense losses. We empathize with the heartbreaks of war victims and sympathize with their misery. China believes that war remedy and reparation should be achieved through correct political means and legal proceedings, and embody international will, fairness and justice, and the humanitarian spirit. Useful practice of the Security Council and the GA in this regard can provide important reference for similar actions by the international community. Regrettably, the draft resolution on remedy and reparation submitted for action at this emergency special session of the GA has obvious flaws and loopholes and does not conform to China's position and proposition. I wish to share the following 3 observations. First, the draft resolution seeks to directly address the issue of international legal responsibility through the GA, thereby overstepping GA's authority. The UN Charter clearly provides for the authorities of main UN bodies. The General Assembly is not an international judicial body and has no right to legally define or hold accountable internationally wrongful acts. The resolutions previously adopted by the 11th Emergency Special Session do not constitute a legal basis for remedy and reparation. Second, the draft resolution intends to invoke the articles on the responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts to pursue accountability, thus lacking legal basis. The said articles are only the research product of the International Law Commission, an expert body. They are not an intergovernmental treaty, nor legally binding. Neither do the articles provide legal norms to define an internationally wrongful act or determine whether such an act exists. It's thus not appropriate to invoke the said articles to make legal determination or pursue accountability. Third, the draft resolution intends to bless the creation of a reparation mechanism and loss register by some countries outside the framework of the UN, a deviation from Euro practice. The above-mentioned mechanisms proposed by some countries are not in the framework of the UN or overseen by the UN, nor do they report to the UN. However, the GA is requested to adopt a resolution specifically for their creation. This approach makes no sense and has no precedent in practice. It should also be pointed out that the issue of remedy and reparation is of great importance and far-reaching implications, and bears on peace and security on the one hand, justice and conscience on the other, political correctness on the one hand, and international rule of law on the other. It concerns both current situation and historical injustices. Countries in the world victimized by internationally wrongful acts such as colonialism, external interference, unilateral sanctions, and economic blockades all have the right to seek remedy and reparation. The action taken by the GA today should help to provide correct guidance for the settlement of possible future claims of relevant countries for remedy and reparation, and should help to maintain the impartial image of the UN that treats all member states equally. It should help to ensure various UN bodies can work according to their respective mandates. Such an important draft resolution should go through full discussion and extensive consultation by member states to build consensus and bridge differences as much as possible, so as to ensure that it can stand the test of history politically, legally, and procedurally. Regrettably, the sponsors did not organize consultations in earnest, did not substantively respond to the concerns of member states, and instead insisted on pushing the GA to take hasty action, which is totally unconstructive. Based on the above, and to uphold the authority of the UN Charter and the credibility of the UNGA to safeguard true multilateralism and the spirit of solidarity and cooperation, and to maintain the international rule of law and fairness and justice, China will vote against the draft resolution. Mr. President, the Ukrainian crisis has lasted nearly 9 months. It has sent shockwaves throughout the world and brought more uncertainty and instability to our already turbulent world. If the conflict goes longer, gets bigger, becomes more complicated than it is already, it serves no party's interests, and the developing countries are going to bear the brunt. China once again calls on all parties concerned to return to dialogue and negotiation as soon as possible and push the situation back to the right track of political settlement. The international community, including the GA, should work actively to this end, instead of intensifying tensions, provoking confrontation, and aggravating divisions. Finally, I wish to reiterate that China's position on the Ukrainian issue is consistent and clear. We always maintain that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be abided by, and the legitimate security concerns of all parties should be taken seriously. All efforts conducive to the peaceful resolution of the crisis should be supported. China is willing to continue to work with the international community and play a constructive role in promoting the early realization of ceasefire and cessation of hostilities, the easing of the situation, and the political settlement of the crisis. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of China. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Mr. President, France associates itself with the statement made by the European Union and would like to add the following in our national capacity. We are firmly committed to stand with Ukraine and Ukrainian people to ensure that justice is rendered to all of the victims of this illegal war by Russia against Ukraine. The victims have to be respected in terms of their dignity and their rights, and it is in this spirit that France actively supports the Ukrainian authorities in the legal actions they have undertaken. Together with 43 other states, we have seized the International Criminal Court, and we support it financially and politically in the investigations it's currently conducted in Ukraine. France supports the collection of evidence conducted by the mechanisms of inquiry as well as by national and international jurisdictions. On the 4th of March 2022, the Human Rights Council created an international and independent commission of inquiry, which is to collect and analyze pieces of evidence of crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. On the 23rd of September, the chair of this commission presented his report to the 51st session of the Human Rights Council, which concludes very clearly that war crimes have been committed in Ukraine. It's on the basis of this information that France supports and co-sponsors the resolution which recommends the creation of a future register to record the information and evidence to make sure that claims concerning the damages, loss, and injuries to Ukrainian victims of the war provoked by Russia could be presented. Mr. President, impunity is not conceivable, not elsewhere, not in Ukraine. Russia will be held responsible and will have to be held to account of all the crimes and flagrant violations of international law, and will have to bear the legal consequences of all of the international wrongful acts committed in Ukraine. We call, therefore, on members of the Assembly to provide all of their support to the draft resolution. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of France. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. South Africa continues to express its deep regret that the war in Ukraine persists despite its devastating impact and negative humanitarian effects on the people of Ukraine, including women and children. This is a war whose impact is also felt in countries all over the world, as it contributes to the current debilitating global food, fuel, and financial crisis. The war, no doubt, is contributing to slowing down the momentum on the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. South Africa, therefore, reiterates its call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the establishment of a diplomatic process to end the war. We further reiterate that the territorial integrity of states, including that of Ukraine, must be respected and we reject all actions that undermine the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and international law. Mr. President, Article 1 of the Charter of the United Nations provides that the purpose of our organization is to maintain international peace and security, and to that end, to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of the threats to the peace, and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of the peace, and to bring about by peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law, adjustments or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of the peace. This is what we should be endeavoring to do. We should be asking ourselves, are our ways and action focused on the maintenance of peace or creating further divisions that make the attainment of immediate peace less likely? South Africa believes that the UN Security Council should play a constructive role in the resolution of this conflict, in line with its charter mandate for the maintenance of international peace and security. We regret that in the case of the war in Ukraine, the Security Council continues to abdicate this mandated responsibility. The Security Council has thus far failed the people of Ukraine. However, it is not too late for the Council to play a constructive role in the resolution of the conflict. Should the Council fail to act, the General Assembly should focus on efforts to stop the war and consider resolutions that contain concrete proposal towards that end. The General Assembly should create conditions conducive to dialogue, mediation, and diplomacy as the only path that will lead to a peaceful resolution of the conflict. This is a role that the General Assembly has played before, and there is no reason it cannot do so now. Furthermore, the Secretary General should directly engage the parties to conflict towards an immediate cessation of hostilities. This is a process that should contain clear deliverables and timelines. The Secretary General has already illustrated the constructive role that he can play by facilitating the agreement on the Black Sea Grain Initiative. As we have stated before, this important example could be the basis for an agreement leading to a diplomatic resolution of the conflict. Additionally, the General Assembly and the Secretary General could consider creating a group of eminent persons to assist with the mediation between the parties to the conflict. Constructive actions such as these are urgently required to ensure that we move towards peace. Mr. President, today we meet to consider yet another divisive resolution on the war in Ukraine. We reiterate our question: will this draft resolution assist in supporting Article 1 of the Charter? Have the resolutions we adopted in the last few months contributed to achieving this? Clearly not. We must therefore find an alternative constructive action that brings us towards peace. Secretary General Guterres reminded us recently that more than 2 billion people, a quarter of humanity, live in areas affected by conflict. It is vital that the UN devotes equal time to the resolution of all conflict situations that threaten international peace and security. During the past 7 decades, this Assembly has had clear calls for reparations from slavery, colonialism, apartheid, and from many other contemporary conflicts. Regrettably, in all these instances, we have not been able to find agreement on reparations due to the opposition of many that are co-sponsoring today's resolution. we are clearly sending a message of exceptionalism and that reparations matter in some cases and do not matter in others. The United Nations loses its credibility when it is seen to be partisan and exercising double standards in its work. As member states, we should refrain from perpetuating such practices. Mr. President, beyond matters of principle, the resolution we are considering today places the United Nations in uncharted waters. The General Assembly is being asked to grant its authority to a process that will lead to the setting up of a mechanism for reparations by interested countries. There's no clarity on what the eventual mechanism will look like, its functions, and how it will relate to the General Assembly. We also do not know what its eventual legal status will be. We are therefore uncomfortable that the sanctity of the UN General Assembly will be used to give legitimacy to an unknown process. Moreover, once this is done, it will be deemed that the mechanism was created by the General Assembly, undermining its crucial role and negatively affecting its credibility, which will create a problematic precedent. For all these reasons, Mr. President, South Africa is unable to vote in favor of this resolution and will abstain. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the statement made earlier by the European Union and would like to offer some short remarks in our national capacity. Mr. President, it is an established principle of international law that the aggressor has an obligation to cease its aggression and to make full reparation for the injury and damages it has caused. Today, the sheer magnitude, extent, and nature of the damage caused by Russian attacks is evident for all to see. But this evidence might over time disappear or get lost under the fog of war. That's why we need to register evidence of damages caused, so that later, when we eventually do move to conciliation, we have a clear picture of what needs to be settled. And that, Mr. President, is the essence of the resolution in front of us today. It establishes that aggression occurred, that damages resulted from this aggression, that the aggressor is liable for these damages, and that in order to allow compensation for these damages, they must be documented in a register. And yes, also in response to some of the previous speakers, we do firmly believe that such a register will be an essential element of any eventual peace and conciliation initiatives. And since the General Assembly has established a register of damages in the past, it is certainly within its competence to recommend the establishment of one. We therefore call on all member states to vote in favor of the resolution, to vote to uphold the law of state responsibility, and to vote for justice for all those who have suffered damages in this unprovoked conflict. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Netherlands. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus.
Mr. President, first of all, the Republic of Belarus would fully support the statement made by Eritrea on behalf of the like-minded states. Mr. President, first of all, we categorically object to the procedure this draft resolution was introduced. There was a complete lack of any kind of inclusivity or transparency. There were no consultations whatsoever, and this had once again convinced us that Western states have completely given up on the principles of multilateralism, good faith, and cooperation within the UN. As you all know very well, the Republic of Belarus was at the inception of the Minsk agreements as well as the package of measures for their implementation, Minsk II. And throughout the conflict, Belarus did everything it could to organize negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. It provided for their holding at the highest level, at the high level, including within the framework of the Trilateral Contact Group. Now, the Western states, the so-called guarantors of the Minsk agreements I just mentioned, did they really want to have the situation resolved? Unfortunately, today, the answer to that question is obvious. Endorsing the coup d'etat in 2014, fomenting for 8 long years of an escalation of the conflict in the Donbass, the support to Ukraine as Ukraine refused to implement the Minsk agreements, transforming Ukraine into anti-Russia, pumping Ukraine with weapons, all of that created the preconditions to make sure that both countries have become an existential threat to each other. The collective West never even tried to convince Ukraine to implement the Minsk agreements, and Western states, the guarantors of the agreements, did not honor their commitments. If they had done so, we would not be discussing the problem we're discussing today in this room. The main objective of Western states was in making sure that Russia is weakened as much as possible and that conditions are created whereby Russia can no longer react. The draft does not stand up to any kind of scrutiny from the viewpoint of international law. This is just an attempt to legalize the theft of someone else's assets. This is also an object lesson for those who still believe that private property is sacrosanct in the West. The draft doesn't mention the crimes that were committed by the colonial powers for centuries, the consequences of slavery, the wiping out of whole peoples who lived in conquered territories. No one has ever paid out and will not pay the reparations to countries and peoples for the damage, the kind of damage which, by the way, probably is not even possible to assess, or to all of the sufferings inflicted on those peoples. The draft does not say a word about the current economic terrorism, the illegal economic blockades and sanctions, the attempts to economically suffocate whole countries and peoples. Recently, the UN leadership pointed out that the war in Ukraine today is one of almost 30 armed conflicts going on in the world. And the General Assembly should not make an exemption for one conflict, no matter how difficult it is. It should not place it above the interests of developing countries who bear the brunt of the worst consequences of wars, including the wars underway today, consequences of foreign interference, slavery, and colonialism and genocide. The text under consideration will not bring us one step closer to peace. It will only serve to polarize us. The Republic of Belarus will vote against the draft resolution. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belarus. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Mr. President, Cuba defends sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all states, and the strict respect of the United Nations Charter and international law in all circumstances. We will always defend peace and the peaceful solution of conflicts, and we will always oppose the use or the threat of the use of force. In this context, we will continue to advocate for a serious diplomatic solution, one that is constructive and realistic to the current crisis in Ukraine by peaceful means and by strictly adhering to the norms of international law that guarantees the security and sovereignty of all, as well as regional and international peace and security. Our country is firmly committed to international humanitarian law and calls on all parties to protect the civilian population, its property, and the civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. We deeply regret the loss of innocent life in this country. We also support efforts to ease the humanitarian situation and to minimize the suffering of the population in conflict areas. In this context, we would like to acknowledge the contribution of the humanitarian agencies of the UN system. At the same time, we reject double standards, partiality, selectivity, and discriminatory and opportunistic approaches that some seek to impose in this assembly. The draft resolution that has been presented to us is an example of this. Mr. President, there are many cases around the world of legitimate demands for compensation of damage and reparations that have been presented for many years now by member states without any progress. It is at least ironic to observe that some of those who emphatically oppose considering these cases are among those who are the main promoters of the draft that we are discussing today. Cuba has always defended the legitimate right to fair compensation, but we must start by prioritizing and addressing the historical demands for compensation that have accumulated over the years and that have been totally ignored. We strongly support the just demand that year after year is presented to this assembly by the members of the Community of Caribbean States, CARICOM, to provide economic compensation to them for the damage and horrors of the transatlantic slave trade and the genocide of their native peoples caused by the former colonial powers. 70 million Aborigines were massacred as a result of the Conquista and the European colonization. And tens of millions of Africans were sent to the other side of the Atlantic to work as slaves. However, nothing has been done. Quite to the contrary. We are witnessing the opulent selfishness and impunity that those responsible for these crimes against humanity are enjoying. Those who are associated with the historical development of capitalism. This silence and reluctance to act are also clear with regard to the legitimate demands of our brethren African and indigenous peoples to repair the historic efforts caused by colonialism during over 500 years of expoliation and ignominy. We demand the compensation for the inhumane exploitation of the 3 continents that forces some 6.2 billion people to live, to experience the challenges of underdevelopment. Poverty is not a divine punishment. Its origins can be traced back to the beginning and development of colonization. There are technical and financial resources if truly there were the will to begin to pay for the damage. Mr. President, it is ironic that many of the proponents of the draft resolution that we're considering today have hindered the inclusion of an item on the agenda of negotiations of COP27 to hold a discussion on a financial compensation mechanism for losses and damage caused by climate change. We demand that the request of developing countries for the creation of this compensation mechanism be addressed urgently, especially for small island developing states. The General Assembly has never established a compensation of damage and reparation mechanism for member states that suffer from the terrible consequences of unilateral coercive measures that are contrary to the Charter and international law, including genocidal economic, commercial, and financial blockades. Will Cuba be compensated for the damage accumulated over 6 decades of the implementation of the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the United States? Will the government of the United States satisfy the just demand of the people of Cuba for compensation for the lives of 3,478 Cubans that have been killed, and some 2,099 Cubans that were disabled as a consequence of terrorist acts? Or would the United States compensate Cuba for the illegal occupation of part of our national territory in the province of Guantanamo? Will the General Assembly demand that the United States compensate Mexico for the annexation of half of Mexican territory? Would there be support for the United Nations for the United States to compensate the Vietnamese people for the lost lives and the diseases that today continue to affect so many, and for the economic damage caused by the use of Agent Orange during the imperialist intervention in Vietnam? Why have the just demands for compensation and reparations of the Pacific Islands continue to be ignored? They were victims of radiation and pollution caused by many of the over 2,000 nuclear weapons tests conducted since 1947. When will the families of the hundreds of thousands of people killed be compensated? That those who were added to the list of collateral damage, and the millions of IDPs who, due to the assaults against Iraq, Libya, or Afghanistan. When and how will the lives of a Palestinian child and the killing or the imprisonment of civilian population be compensated? Will Syria be compensated for damage to its cultural heritage, economy, and population as a consequence of the war that has been imposed on this nation? Mr. President, to limit and accelerate the creation of a reparations mechanism for one specific conflict, while continuing to ignore many other historical, legitimate, and well-documented demands, not only is unjust and morally unacceptable, it also severely damages the credibility of the General Assembly. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Mr. President, I align myself with the statement delivered by distinguished representative of Eritrea on behalf of like-minded group, and I wish to add the following in my national capacity. The Islamic Republic of Iran on a number of occasions has expressed its clear, consistent, and unwavering position with regard to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. As a founding member of the United Nations, the Islamic Republic of Iran strongly supports fundamental principles of international law and purposes and principles of the United Nations as enshrined in its charter. In the same vein, Iran has long been advocating the Declaration on the Principle of Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, and reaffirming the basic principle contained therein, particularly underlining that all states shall refrain in the international relation from military, political, economic, or any other form of coercion aimed against the political independence or territorial integrity of any state. Regrettably, the same countries that emphasize the importance of maintaining and strengthening the international peace founded upon freedom, equality, justice, and respect for human rights, and developing friendly relations among nations, irrespective of their political, economical, and social systems or the level of their developments, were and continuing to be at the forefront of the violation that very principles as well. The Islamic Republic of Iran supports the United Nations' ongoing efforts to find a peaceful solution to the Ukraine conflict. The United Nations should maintain objectivity and impartiality in order to play a responsible and constructive role in the political settlement of this conflict. Mr. President, the draft resolution contains language that fall outside purview of the competence of the General Assembly, and according to the Article 39 of the Charter, the General Assembly has no authority to determine the existence of an act of aggression. Furthermore, the General Assembly Resolution 3314 of 14 December 1974, based on the same article of the Charter, call on the Security Council to determine the existence of an act of aggression. We must not tolerate abusing General Assembly for furthering narrow interests of a group of states by shrinking the role of this august body to a rubber stamp, as this would result in further undermining multilateralism and the role of law at the international level. If agreed upon, the proposed mechanism would have no actual contribution to the peaceful resolution of the conflict. Rather, it will serve only as a political tool in the hand of the group of states. Problem here is that the main sponsor of this draft resolution, in a blatant double standard, apply different criteria in other conflicts of the world, such as Syria, Palestine, Afghanistan, Yemen, and so on. We share this view that if an international mechanism is to be established to investigate violations of international law caused by a state wrongdoing and assess the reparation, it should be a mechanism with a broad mandate that could address any instance of international wrongdoing committed by any state and address all the incidents and demands for reparation, including those arising from international responsibility for military aggressions, looting, blockade, unilateral sanctions, occupations, and apartheid, as well as provision of weapons of mass destruction, including chemical weapons, to the brutal regime like Saddam Hussein. The Islamic Republic of Iran emphasized the inviolability, the jurisdictional immunity of states and their property, which are generally accepted as a principle of customary international law. The Islamic Republic of Iran hereby registered its rank a strong objection to any mechanism that any undermine this well-established principle of international law. We would like to record that any act or decision that may be derived from the mechanism referred to the OP3 and OP4 of the draft resolution will have no legal status and will thus be null and void. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Mr. President, fellow delegates, together with more than 50 co-sponsors of this resolution, the United States reaffirms our commitment to international law, including the UN Charter, and to its principles on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. We have heard a lot during this debate, but I think it's clear what the issue is before this august body. The international community must hold Russia to account for its violations of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and for the resulting damages and abuses committed against the people of Ukraine. This resolution represents a critical step toward accountability. It highlights the importance of gathering evidence to support eventual claims for compensation from Russia on a non-criminal track for the injuries, the deaths, and the extensive damage to public and private property caused by Russia's internationally wrongful acts in Ukraine. The mounting costs, including the appalling human toll of Russia's unprovoked and unlawful invasion of its neighbor and fellow UN member state, are tremendous. To date, there have been thousands killed, millions more displaced, and an untold number disappeared. Reports are multiplying of atrocities and other abuses, including of forced deportation, the deliberate separation and kidnapping of children from their families and forced adoptions in Russia, torture, and the bombing of maternity hospitals. Russia's devastating strikes have been hitting cities and towns across Ukraine, with shells damaging or destroying residential areas and medical facilities around the country, and causing significant major destruction to critical energy infrastructure as winter fast approaches. It is well within the authority of the General Assembly to adopt this resolution. Chapter 4 of the UN Charter gives the General Assembly broad recommendatory authority on a vast array of issues. This recommendation to create a damages register is an important initial step toward the eventual establishment of a claims adjudication mechanism to assess the full scope of the huge toll this needless war is taking on Ukraine and its people. My delegation wishes to reiterate that this is, again, a matter of justice, not geopolitical competition. The passage of this resolution underscores the United Nations' strong message to would-be aggressors around the world that breaching international law, including the UN Charter, will have consequences, and that the international community, all of us, will hold violators to account. Compensation for the victims of aggression would serve then as a deterrent against future breaches of international peace and security. Secretary General Guterres was clear when he said that Russia's actions are, quote, a violation of the principles of the UN Charter and international law, unquote. This vote, therefore, is a vote for accountability and for the defense of the Charter. It is understandable and right for Ukraine to want a cataloging of the mounting consequences, including the appalling human toll of Russia's unprovoked and unlawful invasion. Ukraine will one day rebuild. That is not at question here. The point is the imperative for us, the international community, to hold the perpetrator to account for this needless devastation. Accountability is an important component of any eventual settlement of this war. The passage of this resolution also serves as a deterrent against future breaches of international peace and security, as well as helping reach reconciliation. In conclusion, fellow delegates, member states cannot sit on the sidelines when such fundamental principles of international law undergirding the international system are at stake. We all made a commitment to uphold the Charter when we joined the UN. Now, this vote is an opportunity to demonstrate that commitment. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. I give the floor to the distinguished observer of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance.
Excellencies, the resilience of its democracy has been a remarkable achievement of Ukraine in the face of the war of aggression waged by the Russian Federation since February 2022. A key dimension of Ukraine's reaction, alongside its military response, has been the impressive engagement of a wide range of social actors from all segments of the Ukrainian society in the fight to defend democratic freedoms and rights at the time when it was attacked by overwhelming forces of invasion. The magnitude of the physical destruction is huge as the human and social costs of the aggression grow every day. Human rights abuses and violations are being documented in the territories occupied by Russia and recovered by Ukraine. The impact of Russian tactics of systematic destruction of critical infrastructures in Ukraine will have long-lasting consequences. The responsibility of the Russian Federation should be addressed with reference to UNGA Resolution 60-147. For its recovery and the reconstruction of its infrastructure and economy, Ukraine will have to face exceptionally difficult challenges. To cope with them, it will certainly need extensive and prolonged support by the international community. It will also require assistance for further strengthening its democratic institutions. They will be essential for successfully countering corruption and achieving the ambitious results of what will likely be a multi-billion reconstruction investment plan. In fact, Russia targeted not only strategic military infrastructures, but also civilian targets, public services, supply networks, and centers. Among such critical infrastructures, we should also include political and civil society institutions and actors at the local level whose past engagement in Ukrainian democracy was seen as a threat towards Russia's strategic interests and a threat to its illegal and illegitimate claim to retain control of captured areas despite the sovereignty, independence, unity, and integrity of Ukraine. Let us never forget that this conflict is not only about sovereignty, but also about democracy. Russia's war of aggression is an attack on a political system, democracy, that securely places the destiny of the country in the hands of Ukrainians and out of the reach of Russia. The coming process of reconstitution and recovery from the devastation wrought by the invasion therefore needs to place democracy at the center. In recent analysis, International IDEA has stressed some of the critical issues that the post-war economic, social, and political recovery in Ukraine should consider regarding the future of its democracy. This daunting task of addressing the consequences of the aggression, rebuilding physical infrastructure, and restoring basic services should place such issues at the core of the reconstruction effort. In this perspective, it will be vital to allocate resources to support the reconstruction and improvement of democratic institutions in Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished observer of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item. We shall now proceed to consider draft resolution A/ES-11/L6. Explanations of vote before the vote. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote before the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to the Bahamas on behalf of the Caribbean community.
Mr. President, I have the honor to make this statement on behalf of the 14 member states of CARICOM in explanation of vote on the draft resolution. CARICOM strongly condemns the unilateral military incursion into Ukraine by the Russian Federation. We maintain the view that the military action by Russia in Ukraine is a flagrant violation of the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, both in word and in spirit. It undermines the core principles of respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, the non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states, and the obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force in international relations. CARICOM considers these principles non-negotiable obligations to which all of us, as member states of this United Nations, have freely consented to be bound. Mr. President, CARICOM subscribes to the principle that for every wrong there is a remedy. This is a fundamental principle of law and equity, and we believe it to be an equally fundamental principle of international law. Indeed, wherever there are wrongs committed, the victim should be entitled to appropriate remedy, including compensation for injury, loss, and damage caused by that wrong. It is a fact that the nation of Ukraine has experienced injury, suffering, and death of many of its people, both military and civilian, as well as damage to critical infrastructure. The world has seen images of the destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, and other institutions and buildings, causing mass displacement of individuals, businesses, families, and communities. We understand that the cost of repairing this damage will be extensive, and that, consistent with principles of law and equity, the burden of such compensation should be imposed upon the perpetrator. CARICOM also gives due recognition to the global community that views, correctly, that the United Nations is vital to resolving matters of international consequence, including to promote peaceful coexistence in cases where resolution proves elusive. Mr. President, at the same time, while CARICOM supports in principle Ukraine's legitimate claim for reparations for wrongs committed against it by Russia, we believe that such a process must be pursued through an appropriate mechanism. What is being proposed in this resolution contemplates that the General Assembly should endorse a process over which it will have no control, no oversight, indeed, no role to play whatsoever. The resolution as drafted asks member states, having thus given their approval, to then trust that the process will be conducted fairly and objectively, with integrity, transparency, and in accordance with the relevant principles of international law. Mr. President, CARICOM notes in OP3 of the text, quote, the need for the establishment in cooperation with Ukraine of an international mechanism for reparation for damage, loss, or injury, and arising from the internationally wrongful acts of the Russian Federation in or against Ukraine, end quote. We also note the recommendation OP4 for, quote, the creation by member states in cooperation with Ukraine of an international register of damage to serve as a record of evidence and claims information on damage, loss, or injury to all natural and legal persons concerned, end quote. In CARICOM's analysis of this call to action by the General Assembly, we offer the following observations on certain aspects of the draft. 1. The resolution does not provide any guiding principles on how the future mechanism would operate or how the register of damage is to be created or managed. In addition, member states are being asked to act on these initiatives in the context of an ongoing war with no real ability to predict any future developments or outcomes. 2. Noting that while there are ongoing judicial processes addressing the situation in Ukraine, there is, as yet, no established jurisdictional basis for the proposed mechanism nor the register of damage. Neither are pursuant to a Security Council resolution nor an order of the International Court of Justice. Furthermore, it is not within the power of the General Assembly under the UN Charter to create these initiatives. For these reasons, member states of CARICOM will abstain in their vote on this resolution. Nevertheless, CARICOM recognizes that the Russian Federation must bear the legal consequences of all its wrongful acts for any violations of international law and or for any violations of international humanitarian law in or against Ukraine. Indeed, Mr. President, CARICOM reiterates its strong support for the principle that member states have a legitimate right to claim reparations and compensation for injury, loss, and damage caused by the wrongful actions of other member states. This principle is to be applied in the present case as well as other similar cases worldwide. CARICOM makes this broader point regarding a range of issues before the international community, including climate action and indeed reparations in connection with the transatlantic slave trade and native genocide. Mr. President, mass atrocity crimes and gross violations of international law demand scrutiny and justice without exception for whenever, in time they occurred, wherever in the world they occurred, and by whomever they were perpetrated. There will always exist a moral and/or legal obligation to correct injustice, including the legacy of past injustice. In closing, CARICOM reaffirms its strong opposition to any and all actions which instigate the disruption of a peaceful multilateral order. We therefore reiterate the call for an end to hostilities, the immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal of Russian military forces from the territory of Ukraine, and the return to dialogue and diplomacy in good faith to peacefully and constructively resolve differences. Thank you.
I thank the Bahamas on behalf of the Caribbean community. I give the floor to Mexico.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, the position of Mexico has been clear and consistent since the beginning of this terrible war. Mexico defends sovereignty, national unity, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Now, there's no doubt that all damage caused as a result of this armed conflict must be compensated in conformity with international law. Accountability is an integral part of the rule of law. With this in mind, we take note that there are judiciary processes underway that could lead to the establishment of mechanisms for the reparations for damage and, of course, to punish those responsible for this. Now, even though that this is an ongoing and fluctuating conflict in which the reparations phase is still far away, however, taking into account that the resolution that we're examining limits itself to recommending the creation of a register of damage, my delegation will vote in favor of this resolution. Thank you very much.
I thank Mexico, and I give the floor to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Mr. President, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela subscribes to the statement made by a delegation of the state of Eritrea on behalf of a group of like-minded countries. With regard to the procedure, we'd like to express our grave concern in the face of an attempt by a group of states to impose on this General Assembly a practice that is contrary to the spirit of transparency, inclusion, and good faith that should prevail in the framework of a truly revitalized multilateralism, so that together we could address the huge and urgent challenges, many of them that are common to all of humankind. We categorically reject the attempt to impose on the membership of this body a draft resolution on which there were never any consultations, or was there any attempt to take into account the visions of all states involved, or to address their legitimate concerns with regard to a text that pertains to one specific aspect that continues to polarize the international community. We'd like to insist that this methodology of work and the continued refusal to forge consensus will not bring us closer to the goal that we should seek to achieve in this international situation, and that is to achieve peace. Mr. President, with regard to the substance of the topic that we're discussing, we regret that those who promote this draft are trying to instrumentalize the General Assembly by strengthening a mentality of a new Cold War, by a policy of confrontation of blocs, by advancing their national agendas and their geostrategic domination interests at the expense of international stability and security. We must clearly state that the adoption of this draft resolution would only add to the long list of unfortunate steps that unfortunately have been endorsed by this body that will only lead to more confrontation, more tensions, and more division. It will only take us further away from our political horizon, and instead of that will deliberately bring us closer to a point of no return that has a potential to compromise the survival of present and future generations. This is a draft resolution that is full of double standards and selectivity, through which what is being sought is not a peaceful solution through diplomacy, dialogue, and political negotiation, but rather to use this General Assembly to confiscate property, assets, and sovereign resources of other states, as well as to advance dubious aims. All this as a result of the application of a series of unilateral coercive measures that violate all norms of international law and the provisions enshrined in the foundational charter of this organization. Mr. President, Venezuela knows firsthand the result of the confiscation of property and assets, as well as the looting of sovereign resources, and how these same resources that have been stolen are then used to finance appalling and criminal projects. Therefore, we're not surprised that the same ones that continue to assault my country, stealing billions of dollars from us, including tons of our national gold reserves, they're today promoting the creation of obscure mechanisms that have both conceptual and operative deficiencies, and that appear to fit the logic of perpetual war of the United States. While there's an attempt to establish this mechanism by the General Assembly, but this mechanism will in no way be held accountable to this body. Also, there are no details on its terms of reference or how it would function, who would incorporate, etc. It is precisely this rules-based order that is being promoted, rules that are that no one knows about, that are used selectively as long as they serve the interests of their authors. Furthermore, the proponents of this draft continue to ignore the just demands of peoples of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean for reparations for crimes committed against them by colonial powers, including by most recent military adventures, and that today are simply ignored shamelessly. However, this doesn't really surprise us, because this goes hand in hand with the double standards that that the West has accustomed us to. It is inconceivable that when we're talking about reparations to benefit European citizens, the so-called international community not only reacts en masse, but also demands and prepares innovative solutions and pseudo-legal mechanisms to respond to these claims. However, when we're talking about reparations for our peoples from the developing world, this same international community, led by those who today are presenting this draft resolution and whose governments have maintained a colonialist and hegemonic mentality, they openly ignore our fight in favor of truth, justice, and reparations. They seem to suffer a grotesque moral amnesia. We also regret the fact that among the promoters and co-sponsors of the text that is being presented to us, there are governments of countries who, similar to Venezuela, have been subject to occupation, domination, and oppression under the colonial yoke, and whose brethren nations to date are demanding, as so many others around the world, fair reparations for the crimes committed, whether crimes such as genocide, extermination, slavery, trafficking of persons, apartheid, and other atrocities. Mr. President, Due to everything I've said, we consider that the draft resolution contained in document A/ES11/L6 in no way will contribute to the goal of achieving a lasting peace through political dialogue and diplomatic negotiations. This is why we would make an appeal to the responsible members of the international community to vote against this text. We'd like to reiterate that, quite to the contrary, our organization must play a central role that it falls for to play in this historic and decisive chapter to preserve humankind through facilitating a constructive and good faith dialogue, negotiations to reach a peaceful solution. If we adopt this draft resolution, we have to stress that we will create a very serious precedent that will lead to implications, very serious implications for the work and the credibility of the United Nations and the General Assembly. To conclude from this tribune, we'd like to insist once again on our appeal to reduce tensions and to stop war propaganda as well as a discourse of intolerance guided by an ideology of hatred. At the same time, we'd like to stress that only through diplomacy, dialogue, and cooperation, without any pressure or sanctions, will we be able to avoid being pushed like sleepwalkers towards a more acute phase of conflict, towards a longer and more difficult phase to resolve, a phase that will only extend the crisis and generate consequences that will take generations to overcome. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. We have heard the last speaker in explanation of vote before the vote. Before proceeding to take a decision on draft resolution A/ES-11/L6, I wish to address the question concerning the majority required for the adoption of the draft resolution. In light of Article 18, paragraphs 2 and 3 of the Charter of the United Nations, is there any objection to taking action on draft resolution A/ES-11/L6 by a 2/3 majority of the members present and voting? I see no objection. The 2/3 majority of members present and voting is therefore required for the adoption of draft resolution A/ES-11/L6. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/ES-11/L6, entitled Furtherance of Remedy and Reparation for Aggression against Ukraine. For your information, the draft resolution has closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Mr. President, I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to the delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become co-sponsors of A/ES-11/L6: Andorra, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Liberia, Monaco, Myanmar, North Macedonia, Palau, Republic of Korea, San Marino, and Switzerland. If any other delegations wish to co-sponsor A/ES-11/L6, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. I see none. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/ES-11/L6, please signify. Those against? Abstentions?
The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/ES-11/L6 entitled Furtherance of Remedy and Reparation for Aggression against Ukraine. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 94. Against, 14. Abstentions, 73. Draft Resolution A/ES-11/L6 is adopted. We will hear speakers in explanation of vote after the vote at 3 p.m. in this hall. The meeting is adjourned.